I remember encountering things in the garden that I used to call the little people, and I didn't know what fairies were at that point. But they were like these little old Welsh men who I would sometimes encounter in the garden, and I would talk to my mum about it, and she would say, "Oh no, that was just for neighbours. Don't worry, it was just for neighbours." Um, and really, in thinking about it, they were too small to be humans, but they were just these little men who would sometimes appear and like look at me and say, "What are you doing there? What are you doing?" And then they would wander off, and I wouldn't see them again.
Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Paranormal Among Us. On today's episode, we have a very good one for you again today. Ben Stimpson is a spiritual therapist. He's going to be joining us today talking about his new book, Ancestral Whispers, which is a how-to guide to developing relationships through different spiritual means with the dead. Very interesting stuff. Stay tuned to hear that. Plus, he also talks about some of his personal ghost stories from his childhood over in England. So some great stuff from Ben. You're going to hear him in just a few seconds. But first, I want to remind you that if you have any paranormal stories that you would like to share, please send me an email at paranormalamongus72@gmail.com. That's paranormalamongus72@gmail.com. And I can either read the stories on the air on a future episode, or I can have you on as a guest, and we can chat about it back and forth on a future episode. So send those emails in. So now let's go to the Boomcaster hotline and let's chat with Ben Stimpson from up in Canada right now. Ben, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for joining us up in beautiful Canada.
Mm-hmm.
You have a book that was recently released back in September, I believe, Ancestral Whispers.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about... oh, look at that. So tell us about your journey writing this book.
Of course, definitely. So a little bit about me. So I'm a therapist up here. I'm a trained spiritual therapist. So that's really a fancy way of saying I work with Jungian, transpersonal, and other spiritual modalities. And as I was coming to the end of my training, one of the major projects that we did in my program was around family history, and particularly family history as it relates to how we developed and our kind of the culture that we grew up in our families. Concurrent to that, I was in a spiritual house for a tradition called Lukumi or Santeria. And a big part of the foundations of that religion is ancestor work. And so I had these two streams of working with the ancestors. And I had such a profound experience of healing through that process that I decided to start to put together a course. In 2019, I started writing this course. I had just graduated and I was starting to work with clients. And then the pandemic hit. And I lost all my clients. We went into lockdown, as many people remember. And I started to think about, okay, well, I have all of this material put together. Maybe this would make a good book. It feels like it's very on point right now. People are looking to work with the ancestors in many ways, at least in the spiritual communities I work with. And so I sat down with a friend who's also published, and I said, what's the process? So I started putting together the book. And I spent the majority of 2021 writing it, and how I look in the book at ancestor work, particularly ancestor veneration, which is different from mourning practices. It's about inviting the dead, inviting the ancestors into a lived spiritual practice in your life now, in the same way that most cultures around the world work with the ancestors. It isn't the ancestors are in some remote afterlife that is completely inaccessible. It's the understanding that the ancestors have a place in our lives now. And oftentimes we see this through things like ghosts, hauntings, those weird visitations that people often talk about, and those encounters with mediums and psychics. And so the book really is a how-to guide on how to develop a relationship through all of those spiritual means with the dead. And so it came out last year, in September. It took about 2.5 years to get out, but it eventually came out. And so now I'm enjoying that. I'm on to my next project, though. I'm moving now to working with spirits in the landscape and, and working with other forms of spiritual allies. So that was really my journey in a nutshell. I hope that was a good Coles Notes version.
So the book, you're in kind of teaching people to bring the spirits to them. Have you gotten a lot of feedback on that from people who have read your book and taken the actions in there?
Absolutely. So I'll be honest, it's a very niche topic. We're really gearing the audience towards people who are already practicing witches or practicing magic or spirituality, or who are spirit workers themselves. What people really like about this is that it comes from a non-denominational point of view. So this is written for anybody of any religion, regardless of really where they're coming from. And I give so many examples of other traditions around the world, and people really, really like that. One of the criticisms that I get, and I think it's a fair criticism, is I don't give people a direction on exactly what to do, what tradition to follow, what ritual to do, and that's very intentional. I want people to take ownership of their practice, and that is connecting in with their own ancestral traditions, connecting in with relationship with their dead, because you can put up an altar, and if you're, for example, very Catholic, very European family members are looking at this altar and are not understanding what this thing is, then they're not likely to come and speak with you. So it's that relationship piece is really strong. A lot of people really like it. I had some fantastic reviews from some of the bigger names in paganism. And I'm really pleased with the rollout. It's on Audible, so it's also an audiobook, which also is telling that the publisher thought that it was worthy to be an audiobook. But it's really early days yet. People are still getting it. It only just came out in the UK last week, so it's still in its rollout. Yeah.
And where can people find that? Where can people get your book?
Of course. So people can find it on any of the major book selling websites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can get it directly from Llewellyn Worldwide at llewellyn.com. And if people want, they can actually go and read a couple of the first chapters, sample chapters on that website too. So I also highly recommend people go to their local bookstores and support independence. They will also be able to get it for you. So really wherever books are sold.
Okay. And I'll have a link to all that in the show notes. So after you watch this episode, make sure that you check the show notes, and all his information will be on there. So
thank you, Paul.
Sure. What kind of what inspired you to do this, to write this book?
Well, it's I've always wanted to write a book. And this kind of ties in with the reason that I'm a magic user, and I gravitate towards the spiritual in the first place. I'm originally from North Wales. When I was a kid, I grew up in a cottage that was almost 400 years old, and I had some very unique encounters with entities and spirits of landscape and fairies that I don't often talk about, but I'm starting to talk more about, including places like this podcast. So the relationships that I have with the spirit world and the encounters that I've had over those years have really inspired me to really want to share that with people. And so this book is a very personal book. I talk a lot about my own experiences, particularly with the dead, particularly with my dead ancestors in the work. And I saw a need. I saw a lot of people are interested in connecting in with family again, connecting in with the dead. But there wasn't much out there that wasn't culturally appropriative. The books that are out there, they're really good. There's quite a few wonderful books out there, but they only give you bits and pieces. They might only focus on the ritual aspect. They might only focus on kind of what you can do as a fun kind of thing around Halloween or Samhain. And so this book was really to be a primer for people to think about relationship and worldview. And that was really a big part of it. I'm a big fan of people digesting their experiences,
Mm-hmm.
because oftentimes how we digest things and how we experience things is often very culturally based. The lenses go up whenever and I'm sure you speak to many guests who describe, situations with paranormal, and they are relating to that through their own cultural worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And so with this, it was very important that I really push people to understand their worldview. And a lot of it's subconscious. I see a lot of this when I work with clients in my therapy practice, is that people are operating with these lenses and are reacting and just existing in the space, in the world,
Mm-hmm.
not realizing what's just below the surface. So that was part of the inspiration for this. But also, truthfully, I just wanted to write a book. I've always wanted to be a published author. So when I saw the opportunity for this, I was like, I'm going to do this,
When did you realize that you had the ability to communicate with ancestors that had passed on?
I think that it was a slow process. I think that I've always communicated with them in a way, because I was communicating them through their stories, the stories that I was told about them. And when I started to dive into genealogical work, which is a whole rabbit hole in itself, right?
Yeah.
Hours and hours and hours would go by. Time became liminal as I got into these records and I started to engage with the stories that were emerging about these people. And I started to notice that I started to get hunches on things. This was really that kind of inner knowing. It was a communication that is a little different from how we would verbally communicate. It was a sense of like a dawning awareness that something, like I needed to go and just explore this little piece about somebody's story. And then when I actually talked to my mum about it, who is one of the main holders of all these stories in the family, oftentimes those hunches were correct. And so then in that moment, I knew, okay, something bigger had happened in that moment. There was like a guiding hand as I was exploring these and researching these. So as I worked on developing that feeling more, eventually it led to kind of psychic mediumship abilities, which have always been a part of my life. It's just an area that I needed to work a little bit more on. And eventually also in working with the Lukumi and Santeria tradition, direct then divination with the ancestors. And being able to ask through divination, through that religion, for verification and so that direct communication really helped me to then understand, okay, there is something there. This isn't just all in my head.
Nice. So let's talk about some of your paranormal experiences that you had back in Wales.
Of course.
What is
of course.
one of the first ones that you've had?
I guess I was always very sensitive to spirits in the landscape and where we lived. So I just want to paint the scene for people. So where I lived, it was very rugged. It was, about half an hour away from really the big major town. Wales, especially North Wales, is a very mountainous region. So if you imagine the Appalachians in many ways, Wales, the part of Wales I was living is actually part of that ancient landscape. And so it's a very old landscape. There's a lot of old, spirits that exist in that place. And my parents moved from Manchester, which is one of the biggest cities in England,
right,
to this little tiny village town of, I think maybe 600, 700 people, very, very small. And where we lived, we were in a cottage that was about a 10-minute drive outside of this village. And, we had neighbors all around us, but the landscape there, all of the homes, all of the houses are ancient. Like there were bits of our house that were almost 400 years old. And even the newer parts of the house were about 100 years old. So I remember when I was very, very, very small, I had to go through speech therapy, because of a neurological condition. So I couldn't verbally talk, in the same way that many of the other kids could, but I could completely understand. And I remember I remember encountering things in the garden that I used to call the little people, and I didn't know what fairies were at that point, but they were like these little old Welsh men who I would sometimes encounter in the garden, and I would talk to my mum about it, and she would say, "Oh no, that was just the neighbours. Don't worry, it was just the neighbours." Um, and really, in thinking about it, they were too small to be humans, but they were just these little men who would sometimes appear and like look at me and say, "What are you doing there? What are you doing?" And then they would wander off, and I wouldn't see them again. I also had in that space, we had a very weird encounter. There was every so often you'd look out one of the bottom windows, and it would be like as if somebody was running past the window. And this would happen often. Like it was one of those kind of situations where it was just that one window or just the other window in the kitchen. And it was almost as if someone was running right past very, very fast. And, when I would say to my parents, "Oh, did you see that?" They'd say, no, didn't see that. I think the most visceral, experience I had was what many people would call, the entity, the hag entity. And I remember when I was very, very small, it happened at least 3 times that I'm aware of. But I remember, lying in my bed, and how my bed was, it was the top of a bunk bed, but the bottom bunk was missing. So I was raised up. And I remember, the doorway to the main hallway was open and light was always streaming in. And I remember suddenly seeing a shadow form on that stream of light, almost as if someone was stood at the doorway. Right. And this entity would often come in and it would have long fingers. And I used to call her the woman in black, because it was presenting as a female shape. And suddenly it was almost like head rush. Suddenly I could hear my heartbeat. I would feel clammy. And then this being would just stand next to my bed and look at me. And that was that. The weirdest thing is that, oftentimes my older sister, who was 13 at the time, and so she's much older than me, she would often say that back then I would be sleeping with my eyes open. She would come into my bedroom in the morning to wake me up or to get something from the linen closet that was in there. And she would look over, and apparently I'd be sleeping with my eyes open. I'd be completely awake, like I would be completely asleep, I should say. But my eyes were open, and it would completely freak her out. So that happened at least 3 times.
Nothing more freaky than seeing somebody sound asleep with their eyes open.
I know, right? I know. And it's funny because I've actually encountered this, even later on. I remember I was having a nap in my bedroom, and my dad, apparently knocked on the door and I didn't hear him. And he came in, and it was almost like I just phased back into reality, like I was dreaming, but then suddenly it was just like a phase, and I don't remember my eyes opening up, and my dad was saying like, "Why weren't you talking to me? You were looking at me. Why weren't you talking to me?" And so it's very strange. So that whole place, North Wales, was just filled with all sorts of spirits. I remember, when we used to go on drives, I would often see lights in the forests as we were driving by. There was a particular mountain that I had a really strong connection with, and always gave me a strong sense of like brooding. And even now, like it's one of my favorite mountains to go and visit when I'm back home. So quite a few things.
Did any of your other family members have this happen to them, to see the fairies or anything?
Not that they'll admit to, but I do know that my mum. So this is part of the kind of uncovering the family history piece. I discovered that my mum's grandmother was originally from Ireland, and she was a herbalist. And my mum has always said she's seen things throughout her life. But she never admitted to seeing any of these little people, in North Wales. She did say once that she was working very late at night in her office. They were both entrepreneurs, and she happened to look up and she saw her father, who was supposed to be, dead in the UK at that point. And she'd kind of stare at, and then the vision dissolved. So she has said she's seen things, and so I suspect that there's an ancestral linkage there. But they're very, very good little Englanders. They don't tend to look at the paranormal as being anything that should be looked at. They're very, oh, well, what would the neighbors think,
Right. And
hmm
the woman in black, was it just the one time that you saw her, or did you see multiple?
It was multiple times. So it was at least 3 that I can remember. Now, I was 4 or 5 years old when this happened. We moved to Canada when I was 8 years old. So I was very, very young. And I do remember, I had a tendency to bring all of my teddy bears into bed with me to protect them, right? So
Protect them,
it may
not to
have
protect
happened
you.
multiple. I know, to protect them as it was very strange. But even when lightning storms were happening, I remember I had a sense that there was things flying over top, and that's a recurring thing in the folklore of many European places. There's the sense of a wild hunt. So when a major storm comes through, and like the UK is maritime, we get some of the big, massive storms that come off the sea. And I remember a sensation that things were flying over top, and that there was something going on up there. Yeah. I also had some other encounters too. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Did you ever see anything that was flying over, or just had that sense?
I always just had that sense, but I always had that sense that there were other things around. Like I remember, I got into my head whenever whenever I was having a bath, I had this sense that there were like little hobgoblins or imps on the windowsills, and every time I looked away, they would like play a game of moving to the other ledge, before I could see them again. So I always had the sense that there was something on the windowsills. And when you enter a space over there, I know in North America you get these in some places, but so many places in North America are so new. When you go to a place that, like a cathedral that's 1,000 years old, you get that sense of presence. And oftentimes I'm very sensitive to that sense of presence. And when you enter many of the places over in the UK, there's that sense of presence. I remember that, just down the hill from where my school was, there was this old abandoned, it looked like a cow barn. It looked like an old stable block, but I was told that it was originally an old care home back 100 years ago. And I remember that, I had, again, that sense that there was something in there that I needed to not look into. But that could also just be, childhood whimsy too.
It's interesting. I spent some time over in London area back in the early 90s, and so much of that country is so much older than here in the United States, and I don't know about Canada, but it's so beautiful over there. And for any of our viewers here that kind of going a little bit off topic here, really, if you really want to get into some really neat looking old cathedrals, homes, and everything, take a trip on over there. It's beautiful over there. Anyway, sorry, I digress. So you mentioned that you had some other activities. Anything evil happened to you, or?
Well, so this is the thing. I think kind of how I look at good and evil. It's one of those things where I don't see it in the Judeo-Christian sort of way anymore. So when I see something as evil, I see it more in the same way as it's evil because it wants to eat me, but it's part of its nature, right? That kind of sense of evil, right? I would say that the Dark Lady was frightening, whatever she is or whatever she was. I have experienced, well, I actually, in truth, I have experienced malevolent beings, or beings that I wouldn't necessarily say were entirely good. I remember a few years ago, I was laying in bed. It was like on a Sunday morning, and I never encountered shadow people before. So I was laying in bed. It was Sunday morning. It was like maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was maybe 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning. So it wasn't too early. But it was certainly a little early to get up on a Sunday morning. And I remember I was laying in bed, and by this time I've been a practicing witch. I've been practicing pagan for a very long time. And I remember getting the distinct impression that there was some kind of being at the bottom of my bed. My bed was facing a window that was quite low, so there was a lot of light coming in. And so I tried to look up, and I was paralyzed, and I couldn't move, and I was getting this sense of presence again. And I distinctly remember this thing running around the bed, which wasn't a long distance, but it was running around the bed to stand next to me, and it was all smoky. And I managed to get the will to just put out like, fuck off. And it disappeared. And then, a few moments later, I regained sense of self again. But I've had that encounter a few times over my life. The weirdest one I've had was actually encountering something we eventually discovered was a spirit that was attached to an old boyfriend of mine. So I remember lying in bed, and I woke up again. It was a Sunday morning, and I happened to look over to my partner at the time, and I could see him, and he was there, and he was smiling back at me. And then suddenly his face just distorted, and I had a sudden realization of like the uncanny valley. And I said, "Wait, you're not John. Who are you?" And it smiled at me, and then its face just dissolved back into the bedspread. And it turns out that he had left like an hour ago to go and get groceries or something like that. So it was very strange. We determined eventually that was a spirit that had been attached to him. But it was bizarre, that realization of, you're not who you're supposed to be,
And then just dissolve into the bed. That's pretty freaky.
Yeah, it was a very strange thing. Yeah. And when I say dissolve, I mean, it was like suddenly the bedspread kind of became his face, and then his face disappeared. So it was a very strange thing. Yeah.
Oh, that is odd. And I like the when he said just fuck off, and then it okay, and just left.
Well, and this really comes from my work as a spiritual worker, right? So a lot of, like you asked before, and I was talking about spirit possession and whatnot. So some of the spiritual traditions I've been engaged with actively work with spirit possession, and that is when a spirit is invited to come into somebody's body and speak through there and inhabit that body for a time before then they're allowed to go away, or they're suggested to go away. Right. And oftentimes those spirits are on a certain higher plane, at least in these traditions, than some of the lower spirits. And how it's understood in many of these traditions is that the lower, more earthbound spirits, the ones that would appear as ghosts, the ones that would appear as in hauntings, are the ones that are more connected to life, or can't deal with not being alive. And so they're really trying to gain a sense of life again. So they stay on this earth plane, versus those other spirits who are a little bit higher, that are invited down. And so I've actively seen spirit possession where an individual is not themselves anymore. I've seen spirit possession where somebody starts speaking in a language I know they cannot speak. And it's interesting to watch, because it's almost like the whole body just changes. It's their body, but there's an aspect that falls over them. And suddenly they're an old woman when really they're a 6 foot, 6 foot beefy guy, right? So it's very interesting to watch. And a lot of the African religions that I've connected with, or I have friends in, have that essence of spirit possession.
What do you do when you encounter someone that is being possessed? I mean, can you rid them of that, or?
Well, so this comes back to that very Judeo-Christian point of view, or Christian point of view of spirit possession is inherently bad. A lot of spirit cults around the world, a lot of spirit possession traditions around the world, that is an ongoing relationship between that community and those spirits. So only those spirits are only only those spirits are allowed to come and possess. When a spirit tries to get in to possess and they're not permitted, and there's various ways, even within the kind of dynamic, to know when that spirit isn't who they say they are, then they are cast out. Oftentimes, and I think of like Tibetan Buddhism, for example, oftentimes the other spirits that are classed as legitimate will recognize that that spirit doesn't belong, and then they will gang up on that and cast them out. Okay. That relationship has been built because oftentimes those spirits are ancestral. Voodoo, for example, Haitian voodoo. If you look at who the Loa actually are, there's various classes of them, but many of them are actually dead Haitians. They're ancestral to the community, the living community, and so it's a relationship. You're just inviting great grandmother down to hang out with you for a little while. In death, there's that idea that that state provides a lot more for somebody. Somebody can expand, a spirit can become other things, and so it's very possible that they might be tied to a sense of place, in which case going to that place, going to that physical location, you engage with the spirit that is dwelling in that place, which could be ancestral, could be a deceased human, could be something more, could be more like a deity and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes those traditions will have ways of dealing with those unwanted spirits, but the wanted spirits, the ones who are welcome, the ones who are, this is part of their life, there's all sorts of ways of catering to them. There's ways of recognizing when they're coming down, when they are about to take possession. Oftentimes possession can only happen within certain sacred spaces, for example. And then once consecrated, those sacred spaces will only permit those spirits, or deities to come down that are permitted, or who have direct control over that space. When it comes to unwanted spirits who are attached to people, there's all sorts of ways of removing them. Often it's through using or gaining help from those spirits who are helpful. And at least in the Catholic sense, then there's those rituals of exorcism, which are quite violent, really, when you think about them. Any of the portrayals, I understand that they are, many of them are actually realistic to what they look like.
I've seen a few on TV. I don't know if they're real or staged or what, but yeah, it does not look like a fun experience to have an exorcism performed on you.
Yeah.
But it could be a necessity, depending on your religion and everything, I guess.
This is the thing; it all depends on worldview, right? Yeah.
Right. Well, Ben, I think this is just maybe the tip of the iceberg. We can find so much more of this stuff in Ancestral Whispers. Of course, pick it up on Amazon, at your local bookstore. Those seem to be kind of going away with digital copies of books nowadays. So where else can people hear your information? You have a podcast?
Of course. Absolutely. So, so everything's on my website, benstimpson.com. I also offer classes and I also offer spiritual, consultation on there too. And so I run a podcast called Essence with Ben Stimpson, and the majority of the guests that I have on are authors in the spiritual realm. So, this coming season that we're currently playing, I'm in my third season, are all traditional and folkloric witches. Many of them are spirit workers. Many of them are working with the spirits of the dead. Next season, I have a kind of a mixed bag of people. I've got tarot readers, I've got mediums, I've got all sorts of other interesting authors. And this past season, I focused mostly on queer practitioners and those who are working within the liminal spaces. And you often see now a lot of spirit workers who are within those kind of liminal, marginal spaces. A lot of BIPOC practitioners on there too. So really really interesting conversations, and most of them are authors who have books out. I feel like we're going through a real renaissance where people are really interested in engaging with the spirit world again, in a way that is tying back into a traditions that for a long time have been looked down upon as just fairy tales and stories that for children. So go and check that out. You can check that on Spotify. I also have a YouTube page where all the videos are, and please go and like and subscribe.
Awesome. And I'll have all the links to all that in the show notes. And I 100% even more agree with you about more people seem to be coming forward and talking about seeing ghosts, seeing even more than that, seeing aliens and UFOs and stuff. I guess in the past maybe it was people kind of holding that in, thinking, oh man, if I come forward, people are going to be making fun of me, saying that I'm not right. But it seems like the last 20 years or so, people are coming out more and saying what they've seen. And I think that's pretty good. I mean, let's get this all out in the open and, talk about it.
Well, this is the thing, and everybody, I suspect everybody, if you really ask them, have experienced something paranormal. Even if it's just a feeling, even if it's just a sense, even if it's just the whiskers on the back of your neck going on end because you suddenly feel like something's watching you, right? I feel like that's a recurring thing. And again, people are very open to that. The communities that I really work within and I exist within, this is just a normal part of life. Right. And oftentimes we can then determine when is something maybe a mental health issue versus when is something an authentic lived experience. And in the therapy world, I'll speak to that for a moment. There are actually a lot of studies being done on kind of religious and spiritual experiences, and then when to know the difference between kind of psychosis and that, again, authentic, normal lived experience. And I would say the majority of us have normal lived experiences of the paranormal in many ways. So,
and I haven't had many paranormal experiences that I can recall. I have, smelt my dad's cologne in the house, and he whisked by or whatever. But my wife has had a few instances, and it's really interesting. And I know that they're among us. They're with us.
Yeah.
So great stuff.
Yeah, it's one of those things. One last comment on that. From the psychological perspective, society plays a big role in that. We're socialized to not see things that don't fit into society's expectations. So a good technique that I think I talk about this in the book is to just sit for a second and be completely mindful of everything that's going around you. And guaranteed you won't actually see everything that's going around you. Something can be right in front of you and you will just not see it because you're either not expecting it to be there or society has socialized you to just not see it. The lenses that we use to construct reality are really socialized into us from very, very early on. And there's all sorts of meditation techniques in order to open and expand our awareness. Part of that is also that we would just be overloaded if we took in everything all at once. So for me, a lot of the paranormal exists in those spaces that are just outside of the phase of being seen. And so it takes a bit of effort, but I think that it takes, I think most people can develop the ability to explore and see in things. A friend of mine, Matt Oren, came out with a wonderful series of books, and his book, Psychic Witch, is packed full of, these wonderful exercises on expanding, awareness. And so I highly recommend that for anybody. But when people say, I haven't experienced a lot, I think that when you actually ask them, like for you and your father's cologne or grandfather's cologne, there's a lot more to that. It just takes a bit of time to ask and feel safe to explore that. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Society is changing. I agree with you.
Yeah. And when I smelt that, I remember asking and looking around, okay, Dad, show me a sign, show me that you're here, do something, move something. I didn't get anything.
Right.
But the cologne smell kind of lingered for a little while, and it was very obviously him. But anyway, Ben, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. It's been very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Again, everybody go over to Amazon, check out his book, Ancestral Whispers. Sounds like it's a great read. I can't wait to do that myself. And also check out his podcast and his website and everything. So Ben, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with all of us.
Thank you very much.
And that's all the time we have for now. I want to thank my special guest, Ben Stimpson, for joining us today. Make sure you head on over to Amazon or your local bookstore to pick up a copy of his book, Ancestral Whispers. And make sure you head on over to check out his website and his podcast. I will have all the links for that in the show notes after the show here. So also, I want to make sure that you guys remember that if you have any ghost stories or any other paranormal stories that you would like to share, please feel free to email me at paranormalamongus72@gmail.com. That's paranormalamongus72@gmail.com. And I can either read the stories on a future episode, or I can have you on as a guest, and we can talk about it on a future episode. That'll be fun. So thank you all for watching, and until next time, stay safe, everyone, and I will see you on the next episode of Paranormal Among Us.